She was just a waitress running 5 minutes late, soaked to the bone, about to lose everything she'd worked 4 years to build. Emma Carter had no idea the elderly stranger shivering in the rain the night before was watching from across the street as her manager tore her apart in front of a silent crowd. She didn't know his hand was on the door handle. She couldn't have imagined that when he finally stepped inside that diner, every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every ounce of humiliation would be turned on its head. Before we dive deeper into this story, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more powerful, emotional stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The storm had no mercy that night. Rain hammered against the windshield of Emma's beaten pickup truck like fists demanding entry, and the wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. The road ahead dissolved into streaks of gray and black, headlights barely cutting through the downpour. Emma's hands ached from gripping the wheel too tight, her gray uniform still damp from the coffee she'd spilled hours earlier during the dinner rush. The diner had closed late again. Her manager had made sure of that, piling extra cleaning duties on her while he disappeared into the back office. All she wanted now was the silence of her small apartment and the warmth of her worn-out couch. The storm had other plans. As she rounded a bend on the empty highway, her headlights caught something that made her foot ease off the gas. A black luxury sedan sat crooked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain like a dying heartbeat. The hood was propped open, steam rising in desperate, thinning curls that vanished into the night. Standing beside the car, illuminated in brief flashes by her headlights, was an elderly white man in a drenched coat, one hand braced against the fender for balance, the other clutching a cell phone that clearly wasn't helping him. No umbrella, no help, just a soaked business suit and a face that looked resigned to fate. Emma slowed to a crawl, her brain running through every warning she'd ever heard about stopping for strangers on dark roads. It was past midnight. The stretch of highway was empty. Nobody would know if something went wrong. But she also saw the way his shoulders trembled, not just from cold but from exhaustion. She saw how his fingers fumbled with the phone, trying again and again to find a signal that wasn't there. He wasn't a threat. He was just someone who needed help. She pulled over 10 feet ahead of his car, the truck's tires splashing through standing water. The rain drummed against her roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. She rolled down her window halfway, and the smell of wet asphalt and engine oil flooded in, sharp and metallic. The cold wind bit at her face. "You all right out there?" she called over the roar of the storm. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended, but it carried. The man turned, startled, squinting through the rain as though he couldn't believe someone had actually stopped. Water ran down his face in streams. "My car died," he said, his voice hoarse. "No tow trucks are answering. I think I took a wrong turn somewhere." His tone was defeated, but polite, the kind of politeness that came from years of practice, not expectation. Emma reached across and unlocked the passenger door, leaning toward the open window. "You'll freeze to death out here. Get in before you drown." For a moment, he just stood there, studying her. She could see the calculation in his eyes, a stranger offering help on a deserted road in the middle of storm. It was the kind of moment that could go either way. Then he nodded, pulled open the door, and slid into the seat, dripping water onto the worn fabric. The heater in her truck barely worked, coughing out lukewarm air that smelled faintly of burnt dust, but she cranked it up anyway. The hum filled the silence as she eased back onto the road, driving slowly through the storm. "You didn't have to stop," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight she couldn't quite place. Emma shrugged, keeping her eyes on the road. "Guess I did. Can't leave somebody's grandfather melting in the rain." That earned a faint, tired laugh. He introduced himself as Thomas Bennett, said he'd been driving back from a business meeting outside the city when the storm caught him halfway. His car had given up shortly after. Emma listened but didn't pry. She just drove, the headlights sweeping over wet trees and empty road, the rhythm of the rain a steady, heavy drumbeat on the roof. She took him to her neighborhood, a row of narrow apartment buildings shadowed by flickering streetlights that barely held back the darkness. Inside her small one-room flat, she handed him a towel and made him a cup of instant soup, the kind that came in packets and tasted like salt and regret, but was warm enough to matter. The radiator in the corner clicked weakly, struggling to heat the space. She gave him her only blanket, brushing off his protests with a tired smile. "How about a coat? You need it more." When he finally drifted off on her sagging couch, she sat by the window, watching the rain slow to a drizzle. Her reflection in the glass looked exhausted but peaceful. She had done the right thing, and that was enough. Before dawn broke, she left for her shift at the diner. The couch was empty when she glanced back. The blanket was folded neatly on the armrest. A small note rested on the table, written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She smiled faintly, folded the note into her coat pocket, and stepped back into the gray morning. The streets were slick, the air sharp with cold. She didn't know yet that the man she'd helped would walk into her life again, or that when he did, everything would change. The morning was cold and gray, the kind that made everything feel slower and heavier. Emma's shoes squeaked against the diner floor as she rushed through the door, 10 minutes late and breathless from sprinting up the hill. Her hair was still damp, plastered against her forehead, and her coat dripped onto the tiles. The smell of frying bacon and cheap coffee hit her like a wall, familiar but suffocating. Behind the counter, her manager Rick Dawson was already barking orders, his sleeves rolled up, his voice loud enough to cut through the morning chatter. "Carter, you think the clock stops for you?" His tone dripped with contempt, sharp and meant to wound. Emma caught her breath, keeping her eyes down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson. My car, save it," he snapped, slamming a receipt pad onto the counter hard enough to make the salt shakers rattle. "We've got a packed morning, the owner's visiting today, and you strolling like you're doing us all a favor." A few customers turned their heads. The young cook froze mid-flip at the grill. The clatter of dishes quieted. The air in the diner thickened with tension, every pair of eyes suddenly aware of the confrontation unfolding. Emma tried again, her voice calm and measured despite the heat rising in her chest. "I had to help someone last night. An elderly man broke down in the storm. I couldn't just leave him there." Rick cut her off with a dismissive wave, his face twisted in a sneer. "You think good deeds pay your rent? You're late. That's all that matters here." He turned toward the crowd, raising his voice like a showman. "If any of you want to show up late too, maybe you can join her out the door." A few customers chuckled nervously. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Emma's chest tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Please, Mr. Dawson, I worked here 4 years. You know, I don't make a habit of—" He pointed sharply toward the door, cutting her off. "You're done. Hand over your apron. I don't need excuses. I need reliability." The silence that followed was brutal. Even the fryer seemed to stop bubbling. Emma's hands trembled as she untied her apron, her jaw clenched tight to keep from breaking. She laid it carefully on the counter, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she turned toward the door, a woman in a booth whispered to her friend, loud enough to be heard, "That poor thing. She's the nicest one here." Emma walked out into the drizzle, the bell above the door jingling softly one last time. The rain was lighter now, but somehow it stung worse than the storm the night before. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking, her vision blurred, her throat burning. Inside the diner, Rick straightened his tie and smirked satisfied. "Perfect timing," he muttered to the cook. "Owner's finally coming today. Last thing I need is charity cases making the place look sloppy." Outside, Emma stopped at the corner, staring down at her reflection in a puddle at her feet. She had done the right thing. She was sure of it, but right didn't pay bills. It didn't keep a roof over her head or food in her fridge. She wiped her eyes quickly and kept walking. What she didn't notice was the black sedan rolling slowly past the diner, its tinted window lowering just slightly. Inside, Thomas Bennett watched her walk away, his face unreadable, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The note she'd written him sat on the passenger seat beside him, folded carefully. He adjusted his tie, looked back at the diner's flickering neon sign through the rain-streaked glass, and said softly to himself, "So this is where she works." He pressed the gas pedal, the car gliding forward smoothly. What happened next would rewrite both their lives. By noon, the rain had stopped entirely, and weak sunlight spilled through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. The smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air. Rick stood by the counter, straightening napkin holders for the 5th time, his movements jittery and rehearsed. He was nervous, though he'd never admit it. The staff whispered among themselves. No one had ever met the elusive owner of the diner, the man who'd bought the place years ago, but never showed his face. Today was supposed to be the day. At exactly 12:30, the door opened. The bell chimed once, clear and sharp. A tall, silver-haired man stepped inside, dressed in a dark tailored coat and polished shoes, his presence calm, but commanding in a way that made the entire room go still. He didn't have to raise his voice or make a scene. People simply noticed him. The cook paused mid-turn at the grill. A waitress froze with a coffee pot half raised. Rick hurried forward, a salesman's smile plastered across his face. "Mr. Bennett." "Welcome, sir," Rick said, his voice pitched high with forced warmth. "Everything's running perfectly. Clean, efficient, just like you'd want it." Thomas Bennett scanned the room slowly, his eyes moving over the booths, the counter, the polished chrome, the nervous staff trying not to stare. But when his gaze landed on the empty corner where Emma used to work, his jaw tightened slightly. "Where's the young woman from last night?" he asked, his voice even and calm. Rick blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, sir." "Emma Carter," Bennett said again, his tone unchanged but heavier. "The waitress who worked here yesterday morning." The manager forced a laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, her. I had to let her go, I'm afraid. Always late. Poor attitude. Not the kind of image you'd want for your business, sir." Bennett's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed was razor-sharp, cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. He turned slowly toward the cook, his voice calm but firm. "Is that true?" The cook looked down at his shoes, shifting his weight. "No, sir. Emma was the best we had. Never missed a shift until today." Rick's smile faltered, cracks forming in his confident facade. "People like to exaggerate, sir. I run a tight ship here. Standards matter." Bennett stepped closer, his eyes locked on Rick's. "You fired her this morning?" "Yes, sir." "For cause?" Bennett nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Then he said quiet but absolute, "Call her back." Immediately, the color drained from Rick's face. "Sir, that won't be necessary." "She's not." I said call her back. The room went dead silent. 5 minutes later, the bell above the door chimed again. Emma stepped inside, still in her wrinkled uniform, confusion written across her face. Every head in the diner turned as she walked in, unsure why she'd been summoned, her heart pounding in her chest. Bennett's expression softened when he saw her. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady but warm, "you helped me last night when no one else would. You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. You just saw a person who needed help." Whispers rippled through the diner like wildfire. The cook dropped his spatula. The waitress gasped audibly. Bennett continued, his voice carrying weight and certainty. "You showed me what this place should represent, so I'm making it official. Emma Carter is reinstated as co-manager, effective immediately." Rick's jaw fell open, his face going pale. "You can't be serious." "She's just, I'm very serious," Bennett interrupted, his tone cold now. "You wanted to impress me, Mr. Dawson. Congratulations. You just did it the wrong way." The staff clapped quietly, relief flooding the room like a wave breaking against the shore. Emma stood speechless, tears brimming in her eyes, her hands trembling at her sides. Bennett smiled faintly, the warmth returning to his face. "You gave me kindness in the rain. I intend to return it with respect." The bell above the door jingled again as new customers walked in, unaware they were stepping into a diner that had just changed forever. Over the following weeks, the diner transformed. The mornings buzzed with energy, regulars returned with friends, and laughter filled the booths again. Under Emma's quiet but confident leadership, things ran smoother than they ever had. Tips increased. Customers stayed longer. Bennett's visits became less about oversight and more about pride in what they'd built together. But not everyone shared that pride. Rick's smile had gone hollow. He worked the register now, no longer the boss, just another employee answering to the woman he'd once humiliated in front of crowd. Each time Emma passed by him, polite and unbothered, something darker grew behind his calm expression. He stayed late after hours, pacing the empty kitchen, muttering to himself. Then the cash started going missing. At first it was small, $50 here, $70 there. Emma caught it during a late-night count, checking the register twice, then 3 times. No mistakes. She didn't accuse anyone openly, but the worry settled deep in her chest. When it happened again, she went straight to Bennett. "I've balanced every register myself," she said, her voice steady but strained. "It's deliberate. Someone's trying to make it look like I'm stealing." Bennett studied her face carefully, then nodded. "Do you have any guesses?" "None I can prove," she admitted. He nodded again. "Then we'll find proof." That evening, hidden cameras were installed near the counters and registers. Bennett brought in a quiet man in plain clothes, a private investigator who blended seamlessly into the background. No one in the diner knew except him and Emma. Days passed. Emma worked as usual, smiling through the tension, her movements calm and professional. Rick kept to himself, but his eyes lingered too long on the drawer she used, watching, calculating. Then one Tuesday night, while rain returned outside, the camera caught everything. Rick waited until Emma left early to handle a supplier delivery. He opened her register with practiced ease, pulled out a thick stack of bills, then replaced her count slip with one of his own, doctored to show a shortfall. He even smiled as he did it, whispering under his breath, "Let's see you talk your way out of this." The next morning, Bennett called a full staff meeting. Everyone gathered around the counter, confused and nervous. The investigator placed a small laptop on the table and pressed play without a word. The footage rolled in silence. Rick's hand reaching into the register. The money disappearing. The smirk on his face. Everything. The silence that followed was brutal and suffocating. Rick went pale, his hands shaking. "That's edited," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's setting me up." "This is—" Bennett's voice cut through the noise, calm but ice cold. "You framed the one person who saved me. You tried to ruin her reputation in my business. I built this place on trust, and you made it rot from the inside." 2 police officers stepped through the door quietly, their presence immediate and final. The handcuffs clicked before Rick could say another word. He shouted curses as they let him out, twisting against their grip, but no one looked up. No one said a word. The door closed behind him, and the diner exhaled. The rest of the day passed in odd quietness. Emma worked her shift as usual, polite but distant, processing what had happened. When Bennett approached her later that evening as the last customers filed out, he said softly, "You handled that with grace." Most people would have screamed. She smiled faintly, her eyes tired but clear. "I learned something that night in the rain. Some storms you stand through. Others pass on their own." The neon sign outside flickered against the wet glass, its reflection cleaner now, brighter. 6 months later, the diner looked nothing like the place Emma had been fired from. The windows gleamed. A new sign above the door reads, "Second Chance Diner," and every seat was filled at peak hours. People came not just for the food, but for the story, the one about a waitress who helped a stranger in a storm and changed both their lives. Inside, the air was warm, filled with laughter and the rich smell of fresh coffee. Emma moved easily through the room, clipboard in hand, offering smiles and checking in with her staff. They worked smoothly under her direction, proud to be part of something built on respect instead of fear. Bennett sat in his usual corner booth, quietly watching her work with a sense of deep satisfaction. The press had written about her months ago, calling her the heart behind the diner's rebirth. When a local reporter asked what made him give her half ownership, he'd said simply, "She gave me kindness when she had nothing. That's worth more than any profit margin." That night, he stood and called for everyone's attention. "We built this place on compassion," he said, his voice carrying across the room. Emma reminded us what that truly means. "Today, I'm making it official. She's not just co-manager anymore. She's my full partner." The staff broke into applause, genuine and loud. Emma covered her face for a moment, overwhelmed, tears streaming freely now. Bennett handed her an envelope containing legal papers confirming full partnership in the business. "You've earned every bit of this," he said quietly. Later, as the lights dimmed and the last customers left, Emma stepped outside for air. Across the street, under the neon glow of a car wash sign, a familiar figure scrubbed a windshield with slow, deliberate movements. Rick, his shoulders hunched, his uniform damp from mist. For a long moment, she just watched him, feeling nothing but a quiet, distant sadness. Then she walked across the street, calm and composed. He froze as she stopped beside him, his face tight with shame. Without a word, she handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Your name's on it," she said simply. "Open it when you're ready." She turned and walked away without looking back. When he finally tore it open with shaking hands, he found a donation receipt to a local charity made in his name, along with a handwritten note. "Everyone deserves a second chance. I had mine." Back at the diner, Emma flipped the sign from closed to open for the morning shift. Sunlight crept through the glass, reflecting off the polished counter in warm, golden streaks. She tied her apron with practiced ease, her movements calm and sure. The first customer walked in, shaking rain from his coat, and she smiled softly. "Morning," she said warmly. "Welcome to Second Chance Diner, where kindness is always on the menu." If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us all what truly matters. Thank you for being here.